Members of a nation-state are encouraged to be patriotic, but when does a high level of national pride turn into the ugly idea of ultranationalism, where a group of people are fanatically loyal to their own group and hostile to another group? The term xenophobia can help to explain ultranationalism, which is an intense or irrational dislike or fear of people from other countries. If you hear someone say, "I'm not a racist, but," chances are they're about to say something that's racist. And when a government encourages this attitude throughout their society, this can lead to ultranationalism. Unfortunately, there are too many examples of ultranationalism to list them all here, but I'm going to introduce you to some of the more notorious examples. Notice I said introduce. In order to have a better understanding of these issues, you're going to need to do some outside research. And of course, there's going to be many different opinions on the causes and effects of these events, with some people saying that the examples I'm giving you aren't ultranationalistic at all. But that's what's great about our society. We can research an event, talk to people with different opinions, and have an even better understanding of how to create a good society. The first example I want to start off with is the experience of illegal or undocumented migrants in the United States, which can be seen as an example of ultranationalism. Many people illegally come into the US from Mexico and work under the table in the underground economy. Remember that term from Social 9? And there's a concern that illegal immigrants are pushing down wages because they'll work for less than minimum wage, as well as costing taxpayers through government services. In 2010, Arizona passed a law that stated the police could pull over anyone suspected of being an illegal immigrant and demand their immigration papers. So why is this a problem? Because it's racial profiling. Someone who is a fifth-generation American could be pulled over, and if they don't have their passport, because people carry those around every day, they could be arrested. Whereas if I went there illegally to work, I probably wouldn't get pulled over because I'm white. Another example is the internment of enemy aliens here in Canada during the World Wars. In countries around the world, it was common for the government to create camps to house people we were afraid would sabotage us during a war. For example, there was a Ukrainian internment camp set up outside Banff during World War I. During World War II, one of the groups put into camps were Japanese Canadians. The Canadian government took their property away and forced them to live like prisoners, despite some of them being born in Canada. We're going to go into a lot more detail about this example in class, but it's important to know that while we were at war with both Japan and Germany, the German internees were treated better than the Japanese internees, thus a clear example of racism and ultranationalism. In South Africa, a policy of apartheid was introduced in 1948, which allowed for the legal discrimination of black people as well as other colored people. The government justified this ultranationalistic action by saying that if the different races were kept apart, it would minimize the violence. Native South Africans were treated terribly under these laws. One famous protester was Nelson Mandela. People outside of South Africa see him as a hero who fought for equality, but students in South Africa are often taught that he was a terrorist. Which is true, he was jailed for violent actions against the government. But the international community became interested in his story, and eventually, international pressure helped to free Nelson Mandela and end the policies of apartheid. Mandela went on to be the president of the country. But here's an example of how the government can manipulate things to encourage ultranationalism. As the country began lifting the apartheid regulations, police forces would encourage neighboring tribes to fight against each other, in part because it would mean that the police would get extra pay for the overtime they'd have to put in to keep the peace. But then the government could also say, "See, we told you that without apartheid, these people would be violent." At the end of World War I, Russia had a communist revolution. When Stalin took over power, he was very strict on how he wanted to control this economy. One policy he introduced was to have the farms collectivized, monitored and controlled by the government. Ukraine was part of the USSR then, and it was the breadbasket of the empire. The kulaks were the really great farmers and didn't want to give up the control of their farms, so they protested. In addition, many of the Ukrainian people didn't want to be absorbed into the Russian culture and wanted to promote their national identity. In order to crush the Ukrainian nationalism and punish those who protested against his policies, Stalin took the food out of the region to help pay for the industrialization in other areas like Moscow. Millions of people were killed due to the famine he created. In addition, any nationalistic expression was suppressed and punished in an attempt to wipe out the Ukrainian identity. The Holodomor, as this is known, is still remembered by Ukrainians today. World War II saw an unprecedented death toll, and many of those deaths were due to the treatment of people in Japanese prisoner of war camps and the German concentration camps. When our allies liberated the various regions under Japanese and German occupation, they began to see how terrible things had been. The Nazis' final solution had led to the death of almost 6 million Jewish people, along with millions of people belonging to groups labeled as inferior. We consider these acts to not only be war crimes, but crimes against humanity, something so terrible that you have harmed humankind by what you have done. The difference between a crime against humanity and a war crime is that a war crime is an action that goes against the Geneva Conventions, which were first written in 1864 to outline what was acceptable behavior during a war. Yep, there's rules in a war. Crimes against humanity were first considered in 1915, but were first truly applied during these criminal tribunals that were set up after World War II. The international community created these tribunals to try the leaders of the countries for these horrific actions. The Nazi trials were held in Nuremberg, which was symbolic because the Nuremberg laws had codified or legalized the discrimination against the Jews. There were also trials held in Tokyo. The decision was made that only the leaders would be charged, as it would be just too difficult to try all of the soldiers who'd done terrible things. But these leaders couldn't claim, "I was only following orders," because if everyone had stopped following Hitler's orders, the death camps wouldn't have been created. The judges in these tribunals came from the major nations. So some of the defendants were found guilty and got various sentences, from several years in jail to a death sentence. There were also some leaders who were found not guilty because there just wasn't enough evidence against them. The hope of these trials was to show the world that you could not get away with war crimes or crimes against humanity, that we would have the evidence to remember and never allow it to happen again. But that hope didn't pan out. During the 20th century, there has included the horrific events during the attack of Nanking, the expulsion of Armenians from Turkey, the collapse of Yugoslavia, the Blood Diamond Wars in Sierra Leone, the fight between the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda. I could go on, but I just don't want to. Yugoslavia in particular is such a troubling example. As ultranationalism grew, encouraged by President Milosevic, the feared Serbian domination led various regions to demand self-determination. Often this declaration of independence was met with military action to try and prevent it. The war in Croatia lasted for 4 years, with the Bosnian War following less than a year later. The attempted genocide of the Muslims in Bosnia included mass executions. The UN had limited authority as they were there in a peacekeeping role, which meant they couldn't get involved militarily. The events in Srebrenica show how impotent the UN really was, so NATO was chosen to come in and use airstrikes against the Serbs to help bring an end to the war. Later, the leaders of these atrocities were charged by an international tribunal, but it took over a decade to find the 3 key leaders, Milosevic, Radic, and Mladic. And the trials are still going as of 2014, demonstrating how slow this process is. In Sudan in the early 2000s, the Janjaweed tried to commit genocide against the native Africans who were rebelling against the majority Arab government. The world watched this happening but did little to prevent it because they felt there just wasn't much they could do. There really wasn't any international support for peacemaking, which is very different from peacekeeping. There were NGOs that tried to help, but little was done to protect the people. The UN took several years to collect enough evidence to prove that the president of the country was supporting this crime against humanity and finally charged him in 2008. But because the UN will not violate the sovereignty of the country, he continued to rule over the country as the citizens in the southern part of Sudan broke away to achieve the independence they needed to be safe. So how can the international community prevent these terrible things from happening? How can we respect sovereignty but also stop the spread of ultranationalist hate? How can we get the world to be more supranational, or should we?